The darkness of the night is pierced by the sound of boots on the floor. A team of officers bursts through the door, expecting to find just another target. But what they don't know is that the man they've come to confront is no ordinary black man. He's a highly trained commander of Delta Force, capable of taking down anyone who threatens him. The tension thickens as the officers realize their mistake, but it's too late. What started as a routine, unlawful search quickly turns into a fight for survival. What happens when the person you've targeted is the one with all the power, and he's forced to decide whether to fight back or let you walk away? The evening was quiet. A faint breeze rustled through the trees outside Darius Hayes' home, a humble two-story house nestled in the suburbs of Baltimore. Darius, a proud African-American man in his late 40s, stood by the window, his hands resting on the cool glass as he glanced at the street outside. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost too peaceful, until the harsh sound of a knock echoed through the quiet house. He turned, his heart beginning to race, the weight of the moment settling in. "Who could it be this time?" he muttered under his breath, hesitating before walking toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling slightly. As he opened the door, the sight that greeted him was one he had dreaded for years. Two white police officers standing on his front porch, their faces stern, their eyes cold. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," Officer Calloway said, his tone more formal than necessary. "We need to speak with you." Darius stood there for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. A chill ran down his spine. He had always been taught to be respectful, to comply with authority. But something about the situation didn't sit right. The officers were here for a reason, and Darius could feel the weight of that reason hanging in the air. "I'm not sure why you're here, officer," Darius said, keeping his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." Calloway's gaze hardened. "That's not for you to decide, Mr. Hayes. Step outside and we can discuss this further." A rush of adrenaline surged through Darius. This wasn't a simple visit, and he knew it. As his mind raced, he felt an old, familiar tension settle into his chest. The same feeling he had every time an officer came to his door, every time he felt the sting of being treated differently because of the color of his skin. The cold wind that had been blowing outside now seemed to cut through him. Darius wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of what would happen next or the constant reminder that in this country, his skin color often determined how he was seen, treated, and judged. "I'm not going anywhere," Darius said firmly, his voice stronger now, but his heart still pounding in his chest. "You're not coming in." The officers exchanged a brief look, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. It was the calm before the storm. Officer Calloway stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You don't want to make this difficult, Mr. Hayes. You really don't." Darius stood tall, his jaw clenched, ready for whatever came next. The door was now fully open, and as he looked into the eyes of the officers, he knew this was no longer just about a visit. This was about power, control, and the deep-rooted injustice he had spent years trying to avoid, but could never escape. And as the silence stretched between them, Darius Hayes knew that whatever was coming next, he would have to face it head-on, for himself and for every person who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. Darius stood frozen, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The officer's presence felt like an unshakable shadow, creeping into the very core of his home, where he had always felt safe. He could hear the sounds of his heart pounding, each beat echoing in the quiet, oppressive air. His fingers tightened around the doorframe as Officer Calloway stepped forward, his face hardening into an expression Darius knew all too well, the look of someone who saw him as nothing more than a suspect. "Mr. Hayes, we have a warrant to search your home," Officer Calloway said, his voice cold and steady. "We suspect you're involved in something we need to investigate." Darius's mind raced. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything wrong." Calloway didn't flinch. "We don't have time for explanations. Step aside." A chill ran down Darius's spine. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding anymore. He'd seen the headlines. Black men all over the country were treated like criminals, whether they were guilty or not. He was just another name, another statistic in a long history of racial injustice. "No," Darius said firmly, stepping back, his body tense but resolute. "I'm not stepping aside. You can't just barge in without cause. Where's your proof?" For a brief moment, the officers hesitated. Darius could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, but it was gone just as quickly. Officer Calloway motioned to his partner, Officer Lang, who stepped forward with an aggressive air. "This is your last chance, Mr. Hayes," Officer Lang warned, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Darius felt his jaw tighten, his body reacting instinctively. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not after all the years of being treated like he was less than. His hand clenched into a fist, but he kept his voice steady, choosing his words carefully. You can't intimidate me. I know my rights. I'm not going to let you push me around. Officer Lang sneered, clearly unimpressed. You think you're above the law? We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The tension between them was palpable, and the world outside Darius's door seemed to fade into the background. All he could focus on was the men standing before him, their uniforms representing authority, but their actions, their threats, spoke to something much darker, something rooted in years of racial oppression. Darius knew that to resist was to invite trouble, but to give in would be to perpetuate the cycle of injustice. He couldn't, in good conscience, allow himself to be treated as less than human. And yet, as he stood there, the weight of history hung heavy on his shoulders. I'm not scared of you, Darius said, his voice low but firm. You have no right to intimidate me. This ends now. The officers exchanged a look, and for a fleeting second, it seemed like they were considering walking away. But then Officer Calloway spoke again, his voice dripping with authority. This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Hayes, he said, stepping closer. Either you step aside, or we'll be forced to take you in. Your choice. Darius's chest tightened. The words, the threat, hung in the air like an unspoken agreement, a warning of what was to come. He wasn't just a man in his own home anymore. He was a target, a man marked by the color of his skin, caught between the rock of his rights and the hard place of systemic racism. For a long moment, he stood his ground, staring down at the officers who towered over him, silently demanding that they back off. His mind flashed through the countless instances of racial injustice he'd seen in his lifetime, the stories of black men who had been silenced, beaten, or worse, simply because they didn't know when to stay quiet. But Darius wasn't going to be another statistic. He wasn't going to be the next headline. Not without a fight. As the officers advanced, Darius felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. His voice, though filled with defiance, trembled as he spoke again, louder this time. I'm not moving. You'll have to take me by force. Officer Lang's hand moved to his holster, and the tension in the air thickened. This was no longer just about a search. This was about power, control, and the deep-seated hatred that had defined so much of the history between law enforcement and people of color. It was about Darius standing up for his dignity, for the right to be treated as a human being, and for the generations before him who had suffered the same fate. The seconds felt like an eternity, each passing moment weighing heavier than the last. And then, just as the situation was about to escalate further, a voice broke through the tension. Hey, what's going on here? Darius turned, relief washing over him as his older brother, Malcolm, stepped out from the driveway. Malcolm was in his early 50s, his face lined with experience, his presence commanding. He had always been Darius's protector, the older brother who had been through his own share of battles with authority. Seeing him now, Darius felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could talk their way out of this. But Officer Calloway wasn't willing to back down that easily. This is none of your business, he snapped, his voice colder now. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. It is my business. He's my brother, and whatever you think is happening here, it's not right. You have no reason to treat him like this. The officers exchanged a look, their hostility rising, but Malcolm's confidence seemed to hold them back. Darius knew his brother was trying to de-escalate the situation, but deep down, he felt the reality of what was happening. The truth that no matter how calm they remained, no matter how much they stood together, the odds were stacked against them. And just like that, the conflict had escalated, the line between fear and fury now blurred, as Darius and Malcolm both realized that their lives would never be the same. The tension in the air was palpable as Darius stared down the officers who had surrounded his front door. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat, but he stood his ground. Malcolm, his older brother, had tried to calm him down, but he knew deep inside, this wasn't just another scuffle. This was different. The oppressive weight of history, the legacy of injustice, discrimination, and police brutality, hung heavy between them, and Darius felt it in every fiber of his being. Darius, don't make this harder than it needs to be. One of the officers, Officer Brooks, called out, his voice a mixture of authority and impatience. You're just making a scene. Open the door, and we'll talk about this. But Darius could feel the cold sting of fear creeping up his spine. He'd seen this before. He'd seen his own father get pulled over for a traffic violation, only to end up in the back of a squad car for no reason at all. He wasn't going to let it happen to him, not tonight. "I'm not opening that door, officer," Darius said firmly, his voice shaking but resolute. "Not until you tell me why you're here, and why you're treating me like a criminal." Malcolm's voice was low but sharp. "Darius, listen to me. Don't escalate this. We can handle this without getting caught up in something bigger." But Darius wasn't listening. He was too far gone, driven by the frustration of years of watching his community be unfairly treated, the anger of hearing the stories of men and women, just like him, who had been mistreated, beaten, and even killed. Tonight, it wasn't just about his house, his rights. It was about justice. It was about standing up against something that had been wrong for far too long. The officer's voice became more insistent. "We don't want to cause any trouble, Darius. Just open the door. You're making this worse for yourself." And then it happened. Without warning, Officer Brooks stepped forward, slamming his shoulder against the door with such force that Darius stumbled back, almost losing his footing. The sound of the door rattling against its frame sent a chill through his veins. Malcolm moved to step in front of Darius, his arms raised, trying to de-escalate the situation, but the officers were already moving in, their hands resting on their holsters. "Stay back, Malcolm," Officer Brooks commanded, his voice low, dangerous. "This is your last warning, Darius. Open the door, or we will force our way in." For a moment, Darius froze. His mind raced. Was this it? Was this how it ended? With him thrown to the ground, his life shattered, just like so many others before him? But then, something inside him snapped. The years of watching his community suffer, the countless stories of lives taken unjustly, the persistent feeling of being less than, of being targeted, all came crashing to the forefront of his mind. "No," Darius said, his voice rising with power. "I'm not going to let you push me around. Not tonight." He took a step forward, his hand trembling but steady. The officers froze, uncertain of what would happen next. Darius knew this was a defining moment, not just for him, but for everything he had ever believed in. The weight of generations of oppression rested on his shoulders, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. "Darius, please," Malcolm pleaded, his voice cracking. "Don't do this. We can't win this fight like this." But Darius turned to him, his eyes filled with a mix of defiance and fear. "I have to, Malcolm. I have to stand up. For us. For everyone who has had to stay silent, who has been afraid." In that moment, Darius understood something that he had been afraid to admit to himself. This wasn't just about what was happening in this house, right now. It was about a lifetime of injustice, about all the people who had been silenced, who had been made to feel less than. This was his stand. As Darius braced himself, a loud noise pierced the air, the unmistakable sound of the front door being kicked open. The officers had had enough. The door flew off its hinges, and Darius was slammed to the ground by the force of the officers rushing in. He felt the cold floor against his cheek, the weight of his own body pressing into the ground as they pushed him down, but still he fought. He had to. "Get off me," he yelled, struggling to break free. His hands were cuffed behind his back, the cold metal biting into his wrists, but his anger, his frustration, his need for justice, kept him moving, kept him fighting. In the distance, Malcolm shouted, "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything wrong." But the officers weren't listening. They weren't here for justice. They were here to exert their power. The adrenaline coursed through Darius's veins, fueling his resistance even as his body screamed in protest. The officers, now more frantic, pulled him to his feet, dragging him to the door. He was no longer fighting just for himself. With every step, every breath, he was fighting for every person who had ever been unfairly treated by the system, every person who had been silenced, every person who had been pushed to the margins. But just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control, a voice broke through the chaos. Enough! It was a commanding voice, steady and calm, but it carried the weight of authority. All heads turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Officer Carter, the senior officer who had been observing from the sidelines. He was older, his face worn with experience, and his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Back off," Officer Carter said, his voice sharp. "This is not how we handle things." The officers paused, confused, but Officer Carter's presence was enough to make them hesitate. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Darius, then slowly turned to the other officers. "I said let him go." There was a brief standoff, a heavy silence, before the officers, reluctant but obedient, released Darius from their grip. He staggered back, his body aching, his mind spinning. The cuffs were removed, but the damage had already been done. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Darius felt like he wasn't alone. Officer Carter looked at Darius with a mixture of understanding and regret. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," he said quietly. Darius, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with every breath, nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's not just me. It's all of us. It's time for it to stop." For the first time in his life, Darius felt like his voice had been heard. It wasn't the end, but it was a start. The fight was far from over, but he had made his stand. And no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure: he would never back down. The moment of truth arrived when Officer Carter stepped forward, his hands raised slightly in a calming gesture. For a split second, the air was thick with tension. The harsh blue and red lights from the police cars outside cast eerie shadows on the walls of the small apartment. Darius, still gripping the door handle with a white-knuckled grip, hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. Could he trust this officer? Could this be a moment of justice, or was it just another act in the play of systemic racism that had haunted his people for generations? "Step back, Darius." Officer Carter's voice was steady but firm, cutting through the silence like a knife. "We don't need this to escalate. You don't have to go through this alone." Darius stood frozen for a moment, his mind still swirling in disbelief. He had seen officers like Brooks before, people who used their badge as a weapon. But Carter was different. He wasn't just another officer trying to uphold an unjust system. There was something in his voice, something in his eyes that made Darius believe, even if only for a moment, that there was a chance for things to change. "Why are you doing this?" Darius finally asked, his voice raw, trembling with a mix of fear and skepticism. "You're just one man. What difference can you make against the whole system?" Officer Carter didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the world around them was listening intently. "Because I've seen the other side of this. I know what happens when we stay silent. And I know what happens when we finally speak up." For a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like time stood still. Darius searched Officer Carter's eyes, trying to find some sign of deceit, but all he found was sincerity. The brutal, cold logic of survival, the one that told him to fight, to run, to never trust anyone in uniform, began to unravel, replaced by a fragile thread of hope. The officers behind Carter shifted uneasily. They, too, were caught in the tension between following orders and the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Something that could change everything. "Stand down," Carter commanded, his voice authoritative yet compassionate. "Let him go." For a split second, Darius thought he had misheard. It was almost impossible to believe that in this moment, someone in power was standing up for him. The officers behind Carter looked to one another, their faces filled with uncertainty. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The routine was clear: arrest, handcuff, intimidate. But Officer Carter was making a stand against that, against everything the system had conditioned them to believe. "Darius," Carter continued, his voice softer now, almost like a plea, "this isn't the world we want to leave behind. We need to do better for all of us." There was a long pause. Darius didn't know whether to believe him or not. His heart raced, not out of fear now, but out of the raw, unspoken hope that maybe this officer wasn't like the others. Maybe this was the turning point. Then something unexpected happened. Officer Brooks, the one who had been the most hostile from the beginning, stepped forward. His face was red with anger, his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Darius thought that this was it, that the whole thing was about to collapse into violence. But then Brooks stopped. His eyes met Carter's, and something in the air shifted. It was a silent, unseen battle. The younger officer, who had always followed the rules without question, now seemed unsure. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like hours. Brooks exhaled sharply and, without saying another word, turned away. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. It was as if the dam had broken, and with it, the floodgates of possibility opened. Darius stepped back from the door, his body trembling from a combination of fear and adrenaline. "You're letting me go," he whispered, almost not believing it. Carter nodded, offering a small but genuine smile. "You're free to go. But remember, this fight is far from over." In that instant, Darius realized that this was more than just a single moment of mercy. It was a chance for something greater. For the first time in his life, he saw the possibility of change, the possibility that one person could make a difference in a system that seemed so broken. Officer Carter had given him something priceless, the belief that, even in the darkest of times, there could still be hope. As Darius stepped out of the apartment and into the night, He could hear the faint sound of the sirens fading into the distance. But inside, something had shifted. Something had changed forever. As the tension in the air settled, the silence between Darius and Officer Carter seemed to stretch on forever. Darius stood still, eyes locked on the officer, as if waiting for the hammer to fall. Officer Carter, however, remained calm, though there was a subtle hint of uncertainty in his gaze. The weight of the situation, the decision he had to make, seemed to press down on him. The two men stood facing each other for what felt like an eternity. Darius, still handcuffed, glanced over at Officer Brooks. The officer's stern expression never faltered, but there was something in his eyes now, something that spoke of doubt, of questioning the righteousness of his actions. Perhaps it was the realization that what had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into something much deeper, something that transcended the law. "Officer Carter," Darius spoke, his voice steady but filled with a quiet plea. "I've done nothing wrong. You can see that for yourself. I've only ever wanted to live my life, to do right by those around me. But every day, I'm faced with this, being judged, harassed, looked at like I'm less than a man. It's not right. It's not fair." Officer Carter's eyes softened as Darius's words sank in. The officer had heard stories, read reports, and seen the numbers, but it was different when it was real, when it was someone right in front of him, someone who had a life, a family, a future to fight for. Brooks took a step forward, his hand resting on the baton at his side. "Carter, we don't have the luxury to second-guess ourselves. We can't just let him go. He's already resisted, tried to run." "Enough," Carter interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. He turned to Officer Brooks, his brow furrowed in frustration. "This isn't just about procedure anymore. This is about what's right. This is about the kind of world we're supposed to protect. One where people don't live in fear just because of the color of their skin. That's what we're supposed to stand for, isn't it?" Brooks stepped back, taken aback by the intensity in Carter's voice. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate rebuttal. The weight of Carter's words lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. Darius stood still, his heart racing as he watched the two officers. A small part of him feared that things would turn against him again, that his plea for justice would fall on deaf ears. But deep down, he could see it in Carter's eyes. The officer wasn't just seeing a suspect anymore. He was seeing a man, a person with rights, with a story that deserved to be heard. Carter turned back to Darius, the decision now clear in his mind. Slowly, methodically, he reached for the handcuff key, his fingers trembling slightly, betraying the tension that had built up over the past few minutes. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said quietly. "This should never have gone this far." With a swift motion, he unlocked the handcuffs and gently placed them aside. Darius looked at his wrists, then back at the officer. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel the adrenaline that had built up over the past few minutes start to ebb away, replaced by a sense of disbelief. "Thank you," Darius whispered, his voice breaking as the weight of the situation finally lifted. "Thank you for seeing me, for hearing me." Carter nodded, his expression softening as he stepped back. "Just be careful out there," he said, his voice laced with an underlying caution. "The world's not always as fair as it should be. But you deserve your chance. You deserve your dignity." As Darius took a cautious step forward, his heart still pounding in his chest, he felt the eyes of the two officers upon him. He had expected the worst. He had expected to be treated like another statistic, just another man caught in a system that seemed determined to break him. But in that moment, he had seen a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something more. Officer Brooks, still standing off to the side, finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You know, Carter, I think you were right," he said, his words surprising both himself and the others. "Maybe there's more to this than just the rules we've been taught." Carter looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Brooks continued, "maybe we need to start questioning the rules. Maybe we need to start seeing the people we're supposed to protect as more than just faces we're trained to look at with suspicion. Maybe it's time we see them as people." There was a long pause. Neither officer spoke, the enormity of the moment settling over them. Darius, now free, stood silently, taking in the weight of the conversation. The world, as it turned out, wasn't as rigid as it seemed. And sometimes the resolution didn't lie in the rules, but in the decisions that defied them, in the moments when humanity came before protocol. As Darius took a few more steps forward, he turned back to Carter and Brooks. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength in his words. "You've made the right choice. Thank you." Carter nodded again, a quiet respect in his eyes. "Stay safe, Darius." And as Darius walked away from the scene, the sunlight finally breaking through the clouds above, he realized that the world might not change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, it was one step closer to being a little more, just a little more fair. As Darius walked away from the scene, his heart still heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded, he couldn't help but reflect on the lessons learned in that tense, life-changing moment. The air seemed different now, not just because he was free, but because he had witnessed something rare, an officer who chose compassion over protocol. It wasn't the kind of justice most people expected, but it was the kind of justice that mattered. He thought back to his words with Officer Carter, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me." In that simple phrase, Darius had expressed something deeper than gratitude. He had acknowledged the need for humanity in law enforcement, the need for empathy, the need to see each person not as a number or a threat, but as a living, breathing human being. Darius also thought about Officer Brooks, who, for the first time, had questioned the very system they had been a part of. "Maybe we need to start questioning the rules," Brooks had said, and those words stayed with Darius. It wasn't just about police officers or black men. It was about society as a whole. We needed to begin seeing each other, really seeing each other, without bias, without judgment. As the sun set, Darius understood that change didn't always happen in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it was the quiet ones, the choices we make when no one's watching, that truly mattered. And, in his heart, he knew the world was a little bit better today. From the heart-wrenching moments of injustice to the powerful redemption, the story we've witnessed offers a profound lesson about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the face of racial discrimination, it's easy to feel powerless, to fall into the traps of hopelessness and resignation. But as we saw with Alexis, the woman in this story, even the smallest act of courage can ignite a fire of change. Her quiet defiance against the systemic bias she faced was a reminder to all of us that no matter how entrenched the injustice, there is always a way to make a difference. In Alexis's journey, we are reminded that true strength does not always roar. It often whispers, slowly growing stronger with every act of kindness, every voice raised in protest, every hand extended to someone in need. What she showed us was that the fight against racism and inequality isn't a battle won in one grand act of defiance. It's fought in the daily moments, in the quiet courage of standing firm against stereotypes, in speaking out even when it feels like the world is against you. The turning point of this story, the moment Alexis chose to stand up for herself and her community, teaches us that change begins with one individual. But more importantly, it teaches us that that individual is you and me. It's about making the conscious choice every day to fight for fairness, to call out injustice, and to take steps, no matter how small, toward a more inclusive world. As we move forward, the lessons from this story resonate deeply, especially for those of us who have witnessed the long battle against prejudice over the years. It reminds us that our voices, no matter how soft they may seem, have power. The world can and does change, but it takes perseverance, courage, and the willingness to make a stand. Alexis's story is a beacon of hope, showing that even in the darkest of times, the light of justice and equality can shine through. The final message is clear. Change is not just a distant dream. It's a possibility within each of us. All it takes is the courage to start. After witnessing Alexis's journey and the challenges she faced, how do you think we can collectively take action to fight against racial discrimination in our daily lives? What small steps can we each take to ensure equality and justice for everyone, regardless of their background? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's start a meaningful conversation and work together toward a more inclusive and just world. Don't forget to like, comment, and share to spread the message of change.